talk about hundreds of thousands or millions dead. But when you get the individual stories, that's when the power of what they've suffered comes across. Oh, goodness. That's what's driven me. That story should be known. That these people who died in places hundreds or thousands of miles away from their home would have some kind of testimony, that their stories would not go untold.
Why is it that socialism is not only not a dirty word, but why is it so popular in this, our country?
Socialism doesn't allow any opposition parties. Socialism does not allow any freedom of the press, any freedom of expression. You have to control the message all the time.
If you said you're a Nazi, there's no way you'd be sitting in Parliament. That's it, rightly. But it's just not the case with socialism or communism.
How has it happened? Well, today we have teachers happily decolonizing curriculum, going on about transgender activism, supporting BLM and whatever else, and they are actually co-opting children towards socialism.
Before you hear from Mr. Udy, I ask, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you press subscribe, I can have more phenomenal guests like Giles Udy exploring the topics that you at home want to hear about. But without further ado, Giles Udy. Giles Udy, congratulations on your new book, At Dawn They Came, Soviet Terror and Repression from 1917 to 1953 in Russia, the Soviet Union, of course. I've been wanting to speak to you for a long time. I read your book, Labour in the Gulag, Russia and the Seduction of the British Left, which came out in 2017.
Yeah.
At that time, it was Jeremy Corbyn's first election, and now... how many years? 7 years later, have I got that right? Yes, we have a new Prime Minister who calls himself a socialist. Keir Starmer calls himself a socialist. In your book, you go into the horrors of the Gulag and in totalitarianism. I think people who study the history will focus on the mountains of bodies and the death count, the 100 to 140 million people killed in the name of socialism and communism. Here you go specifically into the Gulag, which is just as horrific, and we'll get into some of those figures in the story, and this is really a phenomenal starting place for people coming at the subject, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And but yeah, I wondered if we could start with socialism in Britain today, and before coming to this this totalitarianism in Russia. As I say, our Prime Minister openly says he's a socialist. In the House of Commons, Diane Abbott, mother of the House, has got away with saying that Mao did more good than harm, Mao killing between 60 to 70 million people. In Britain, 67% of young people want a socialist economic system. They don't like the idea of capitalism. On the tube last week, there were posters for communism, and every week alongside the Palestinian protesters, we see the Socialist Worker Party placard. Yeah. Socialism is not a dirty word in Britain.
Not at all.
That seems surprising to me, having studied it myself and having read your work. But I want to start by asking you the question, why is it that socialism is not only not a dirty word, but why is it so popular in this, our country?
For the most part, it's because people don't really know what it is. Solzhenitsyn himself said it's used as a catch-all term for, and I'm not quoting exact words, but it's used as a catch-all term for something that is nice and warm and cozy and fuzzy. Socialism is not. Now, the trouble is that there are some people who know exactly what socialism is, and they will be using the word knowing what it is. And then a lot of people will think, well, it's just sharing and it's all everyone looking after everyone else. And they confuse socialism with social democracy, which is totally different. If you want to know what socialism is, you really need to go back to the man who set the tone for socialism and from whom modern socialism is directly descended. And that's Marx. Marx had two hypotheses which he taught as scientific fact, and his followers took on as scientific fact. The first hypothesis was that the cause of all ills in society was the ownership of private property. That meant that those who had property constructed the state entirely to protect their own property. The law, army, the court system, everything was designed solely for their benefit, solely to protect their position of power. Property ownership also corrupted their minds. And so, therefore, the only people who had a sort of moral purity were the proletariat, the working class. And you see right through the history of British history since the war, people keep on going on about the working class, I am proud to be the working class. And there is a kind of moral purity ascribed to the working class. That is straight out of the original idea of Marx.
Okay, so but there's that definition is what I think communism is defined as, which is, or what you're getting to, is that it's the abolition of property. Yeah. That isn't exactly how socialism is usually defined, which is the collective or state ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution and exchange of goods. Is there a difference between socialism and communism?
The two were used completely interchangeably right up until the war. If you look at the Encyclopedia Britannica, you'll see that the two descriptions really just follow on from each other. In Marx, just to do the second part of that, the second hypothesis, second hypothesis is that history is proceeding inexorably towards an end, a golden end, which is utopia, and that it is a constant series of conflicts between one class and another, and the final conflict is going to be between the property owners and the working class, right? Now, the process by which that's going to take place will be a two-stage process. The first is where the proletariat, the working class, rise up and take over society. That is called the dictatorship of the proletariat.
And it's a bloody rise up as well. He's specific about it being...
because the whole point of it is going to be taking the property of those who own it. Yeah. As you say, the nationalization or the socialization of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Mm-hmm. Socialism comes from that process, socialization, right? Now, once that happens and the proletariat are in control, then somehow or other, and Marx and his followers have never really stated how it's going to happen, over the course of time, society will gradually morph into a place where the state is no longer necessary, state control is no longer necessary, and we all live in this kind of, Marx used the word, heaven on earth. Marxism is a secular religion. Now, socialism, used interchangeably with communism, is the first part of that process. In Soviet Russia, communism hadn't come, which was why they called it the USSR, socialist republics, not communist republics. And, Soviet humor is full of communism is just over the horizon. It's on its way. It's coming. They never really stated how it was going to happen. So socialism is simply communism in action. And that's why the two words get used together, because they really do mean exactly the same thing. They mean the state takeover and control of the means of distribution, production, and exchange. So distribution means the railways, it means transport, distribution, production means factories, and we'll see if we just proceed that production can then include all sorts of things like cultural production, television, books, and whatever else. And exchange means banks, finance, and whatever. If you believe that private property should not exist and the state should own everything, you say the people own everything, but it has to be a small part of the state controlling everything. The workers can't possibly own 5 car factories and 10 steel works and whatever else. So it actually becomes a small group of civil servants of commissars. It gradually gets bigger and bigger, smaller and smaller as it gets up to the top.
One thing that maybe illustrate your point, and one of the reasons I find it difficult to delineate between socialism and communism, is that private property is the means of production. So, for example, with the kulaks, and this also applies to Chinese agrarians and what happened over there, if you have a cow, which is your private property, that is also your means of production. Yeah. So at what point would a socialist say, well, that is private property, you can have that, but this is not, this needs to belong to the state?
Shall we talk about Marxian socialists, just to make it quite clear? Because socialism is Marxism. It's the first stage of communism, right? If we talk about that, look at what happened in Russia, where you couldn't even have small private businesses. Everything was owned by the state. Property was owned by the state. The state ran lives, and the state punished anybody who exercised any kind of private property ruthlessly. They had to backtrack on it when it became such a disaster in Lenin's day. He did briefly make some concessions. But then as soon as the economy was sorted and the civil war was over, then the crackdown began again. And that's why 1.8 million kulaks, small peasant smallholders, well-to-do farmers, why they were all taken off their land, and their land was simply taken by the state. Socialism doesn't allow any freedom of movement, any freedom of ownership. Socialism has to have everything owned by the state. Because that's the only way that somehow or other, according to these people, we're going to gradually morph into heaven on earth, this sort of Garden of Eden utopia.
Yeah.
But they'll never be able to tell you quite how. They'll always just say, no, it will happen. This is the way it's, Marx said it. So it has to be, we have to accept it. It has to be true. But I have no idea. Now, the problem too is that Lenin also and Marx too, they did use communism and socialism interchangeably as well. Yeah. Hence the fact we have the Communist Party. Well, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the Socialist Party of the Soviet Union. It was the Communist Party of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So you can see that there's...
And Lenin called his version of socialism scientific socialism. And Lenin was also responsible for 14 million dead. And that's according to Robert Conquest. So it's Lenin, for some reason, gets a little bit of a free pass here. But he was the first to really institute that evil ideology. And you start that. But we'll come back to that.
Oh, yeah.
I still want to...
No, carry on. I mean, it's confusing because it's a mess anyway.
Yeah. Well, okay. But maybe before coming back to Britain, is there an evolution of socialism that you were getting to? Because we're talking about Marxist socialism. Yeah. Is Corbyn was obviously a Marxist and
absolutely.
It was quite.
His shadow chancellor of the Exchequer,
John McDonnell.
John McDonnell. You know, what are your chief influences? He said in a moment when he was asked in a moment when he was nowhere near government. Well, Lenin, Trotsky. And Marx, he replied. Later on, he covered up and he said, no. I actually mean G.D.H. Cole. Nobody knows who G.D.H. Cole was, but G.D.H. Cole was the man who, in the 1940s, said we must never ever return. He was one of Labour's great political theorists. G.D.H. Cole said in the 1940s that we must never ever return to these limpid social democracies that we had before the war. We would be far better to be ruled by Stalin, even with the barbarities. That's a major Labour figure who became a mentor of Harold Wilson.
Wow.
When you read what some of these people have actually openly been prepared to state, I think by the time he wrote those things, it was quite obvious to the whole of the Western world that Stalin was one of the most brutal, repressive dictators that had ever been known. And yet still, for all the barbarities, he said, it would be much better to be ruled by Stalin than a pack of these social democrats. It's unbelievable. So, of course, that's why John McDonnell covered up, because he thought no one's going to know who G.D.H. Cole is, so I'll just pass it on. I know who G.D.H. Cole is. You just read his stuff.
Yeah.
Now, that I think is the confusion we need to also clarify. G.D.H. Cole decried social democrats. And a lot of people today, when they think about socialism, actually what they mean is social democracy. They say, oh, Scandinavia. The Scandinavian nations are not socialist. Scandinavian nations are social democracies. They still believe in the market economy, but they believe that the market economy should be controlled in order to be able to express compassion and meet the needs of those who are unfortunate in society. So nationalized medicine, nationalized schools, and whatever else are a manifestation of social democracy. And when people say, "Oh, well, look at the Scandinavian nations," they are not socialist.
You don't
Social democracies. And I think a lot of these people you're talking about, this 60% or whatever it is, this is what they think.
Okay, well, I actually agree with you on Scandinavia, although they did have a socialist experiment between the 70s and 90s.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you wanted to get into Norway, they have some what you might describe as state capitalism.
Yes.
Let's
talk in general terms, though, because this is what's in people's minds.
Let's talk in people's mind, but let's talk about France, because obviously Bernie Sanders, who openly says he's a socialist, although pressed might say he's a social democrat, he will always talk about Scandinavia. But France, you might argue, is actually a lot more socialist. Mm-hmm. And let's say their energy is state-run, and actually some parts of their means of production are, in fact, state-run. Would you not think that there might be a case to say that France is actually the really socialist country?
Socialism doesn't allow any opposition parties. Socialism does not allow any freedom of the press, any freedom of expression. If you are going to run a complete state economy, which is owned and run by the people, by the state, that means you cannot allow any opposition. Everyone has to sign up to the idea that what is going on is good, because if you own all the factories and you decide rather than the market would decide here whether we open a new industry or open a new factory. There's a demand for widgets. We need a new widget factory. And so those who have the money invest in a new widget factory, and that essentially is capitalism. But if you have a socialist economy, socialist planners decide how many bathtubs we're going to make in the year, how many tons of concrete we're going to make in the year, and then they issue the instructions to the factories around the country to do that. But they can only do that if they are controlling the workforce. What if you say, we need to have 3 more concrete factories, and there aren't the workers? You have to move them. What if you've got enough doctors that year and you don't need any more doctors? You say, I'm sorry, you guys, you can be plumbers and you can be postmen, but you can't be doctors. So and this goes on. So socialism, and socialism will not allow any criticism at the same time, because you can't have people writing in the newspapers, it's ridiculous that people are being taken from their villages and sent off to this concrete factory in Siberia. You can't allow that. You have to control the message all the time.
So is your argument that unless the state fully runs and owns all the means of production, it's not actually socialist?
Yes.
So you don't think France is at all socialist?
No.
Even though they state-runs, would you not say it's a mixed economy?
Yeah, there may be elements of socialist practice, but socialism is all governing.
Okay.
So when Starmer says he is a socialist, he may well be in favour of the general idea of the expansion of the state, of the increase of state control. Now, how much that is socialism is a matter of individual opinion. If you are going to look at socialism as it's historically been interpreted, right from Marx, right through the history of the Labour Party, right until, so British socialists, right until the years of the war, really, because that was the big turning point, 1943-45. If you take the history up to that period, their understanding of socialism was the Marxist understanding of socialism.
Mm-hmm.
No,
so you don't act. So you might say that. So Starmer might say he's a socialist, and he might have a tendency towards socialism, but actually, in practice, he's not a socialist.
He might. How can I put it? he might have the emotional inclinations of socialism.
Mm-hmm.
I want greater state control. I don't want people to have freedom of choice because I want to be able, or the state should be dictating how they think, what they do, and whatever else. So I would say that's a socialist mentality. I would not say that's a socialist system.
Mm-hmm. And just a moment ago, you suggested that socialism was interpreted in the Marxist way until, let's say, 30 years ago. Or what would it be now, do you think? How has socialism, the interpretation of socialism, changed in the last 2-3 decades?
Well, I remember one of the Labour leadership election interviews where they had all of these guys all lined up, and the interviewer said, are you a socialist? And I think it was way back before Ed Miliband, so I can't remember when it was. But some time ago, these guys, every one of them, they all said, I'm a socialist, but their answers to what a socialist was were so vague, so touchy-feely. Well, I believe in looking after the unfortunate in society. Well, so do conservatives.
Yeah.
And it was almost like they were wanting to badge themselves with what they believed would establish their credentials. But I don't think any of them actually really knew what they were talking about.
Yeah.
Now, the Milibands might have done because their father, Ralph Miliband, was a leading Marxist theoretician in the years after the war, and they would have been brought up in his house. So I think they would have had an understanding because in and out of their household would have been all of these people coming.
Yeah, so that begs the question then, or the implication is that it's a nice word. You say it to signal that you're a nice guy, you're a good guy. So how is it that an ideology, which you can very easily argue killed between 100 and 140 million people, is the most evil ideology by death count that Europe has ever come up with? How is it that it's now in Britain a nice word? It doesn't have a kick. Like if you said you're a Nazi, there's no way you'd be sitting in Parliament. That's it, rightly. Yeah. But it's just not the case with socialism or communism. Yeah. Ash Sarkar is a prominent speaker. She's on BBC regularly. She's famous for saying to Piers Morgan, "I'm a communist, stupid." And if she'd said, "I'm a Nazi, stupid," she'd never be invited back onto television.
Well, I think one of the reasons why I write these books is so people understand what a communist is, what a true socialist is. Not what a touchy-feely socialist with a few socialist ideas, but who actually isn't a serious, I want total state control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange type socialist is. How has it happened? Well, I'm writing a book on that at the moment, so I could go on a very long time because that's been a 4-year process. How has it happened? I think I would just add as a postscript to our conversation before we move on to that is you need to realize that when Jeremy Corbyn came along, he was surrounded and drew in card-carrying communists from the Communist Party of Britain who claimed that they had left the Communist Party and joined Labour. They were pure doctrinaire communist socialists. Andrew Murray being one of them, who was brought in as Jeremy Corbyn's special advisor. And
Seamus Milner, I remember, being a Stalin apologist. I don't know what his...
The two of them, they were old chums right back from the days, their early days with the Communist Party of Britain, when it was the Communist Party of Great Britain before they, like so many other parties, split again and argued over different bits of doctrine. So I think I'd throw that one in there. And you can read the Communist Party of Britain's manifesto, Britain's Road to Socialism today, and it is absolutely gobsmacking. They are anticipating, should they have taken power, they're talking about fighting on the barricades against retired colonels who are seeking to bring in counter-revolution. They're talking about taking over advertising agencies, luxury holiday establishments, second homes. It's an extraordinary document for a party which managed to take over the Labour Party right at the top And people don't know quite what a bullet we dodged when Corbyn was defeated. They all think about anti-Semitism and everything else. That was the least of the problems. These people were dedicated to this doctrine. Now, how much they would have realistically expected to be able to take it over, I don't know. But you hear, John McDonnell was wargaming on taking over industry and giving government bonds in return, which would have been totally worthless. But, there we go. That's a little bit of that part. So, the monster really did rear its head in those years. But if you want to know how it is socialism today is still current, you need to look at the way in which Marxism, and I do use the two interchangeably, so, that's my view. We do need to look at the way in which Marxism has morphed and changed and moved over the generations. We need to see how there has been an evolution of his ideas as they've been taken on, usually by the next generation, recognizing the failures of the previous one, in order to still bring about the same end, which is the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of socialism. Whatever movement you're talking about today, be it BLM, be it transgender activism. I mean from the activists. I don't necessarily mean from the older trans women who are campaigning to take over sports. And
absolutely.
But you talk to those people, or you read what they write, and the whole thing is the same. It's the overthrow of capitalism. Ibram Kendi, the great anti-racist author who's having rather a rough time in America now as his organization is collapsing. He said, the only way we will end white racism is by the overthrow of capitalism. So you do see this. And I mean, if you want, we can go into how that's happened. But Marxism has sort of changed its clothes with each generation to appeal in a different way to the next generation coming along.
So what is its appeal then? What is the appeal of Marxism? I read Paul Kengor's book, Karl Marx and the Devil, recently.
Yeah.
And I think the central thesis might be summed up as being it's essentially the story of Cain. Yeah. Karl Marx, it's resentfulness, it's jealousy, it's bitterness. And so as long as humans are jealous and bitter, which will be always, so too Karl Marx or Marxism will exist and will continue to exist. And he would say, it's not nothing that Marx's favorite quote was Mephistopheles, all that exists deserves to perish. Yeah. And that there is an explicit hatefulness of life itself within Marx's writing. So is it that profound? Is Marxism here to stay, and it'll just take new forms because there is an anger at existence, and an anger at the suffering that is innate to human life?
It's not unfair to call it a counterfeit religion, or to call it an unreligious faith, because we're still looking towards the utopian end. The means to that utopian end are very different from, say, Christianity. The means to that utopian end are exploiting the resentment and anger, jealousy and greed of the dispossessed in order to be able to overthrow those who have. Now, you could say that, well, things need to be shared equally, but that's not the way that exploitation works. A counterfeit religion, I would definitely call it. It has its prophets, to wit, Marx himself. It has its mechanism of salvation, which is revolution. But the big difference is that within Christianity, it was the life of one man and his bloodshed which brought salvation to humanity. In the case of Marx and Lenin and Trotsky, who wrote explicitly about the necessity for extermination and violence being the midwife which was going to bring in the new society, the necessary new society, in their case, It has to be the bloodshed of millions. Because Christianity has a possibility of redemption. There is no redemption for those who are tainted by their ancestry in Marxism. If you are a property owner, if you are a member of the aristocracy, as so many poor people found in Russia in the revolution, you are irredeemable. The only way for you is your extermination, extinction. And you see the same thing in what James Lindsay's called race Marxism, critical race theory. You see the same thing. There is no redemption. There's no redemption at all. You have to spend your life bemoaning the fact that you are white, male, whatever, and doing the work. But the work never brings you any redemption. You just have to be constantly in repentance. That's your role. Mm-hmm. So you never get through these things. So now I think of it. I think of it as a religion. Now, if you think that we've now moved to a place in society where traditional religious faith within the West, Christianity, be it, Protestantism, capitalism, whatever, if you realize we moved to a place in society where that no longer is an accepted, normal way of thinking and of believing, everybody has within them a desire for meaning in their lives. But if religious faith no longer provides that meaning, they look for something else. And a lot of people, the majority of the population, maybe, perhaps the psychopaths, they all want to do good. They all want to adopt a noble cause. And many of those 60% who say they would like to see socialism.
67, it's even worse, 2/3.
They are motivated by genuine compassion for the poor, the dispossessed, those who are in society and are sidelined. They genuinely want to adopt a faith which gives them meaning and makes them feel good. Nothing wrong with feeling good because you're doing good to other people. So they're drawn to what they think is going to be the answer.
So if that's a very good faith assumption of them, and if that is the case, then is it a failure of education?
Education has been one of the major targets of the evolution of Marxism right through, from the manifesto, for instance, because Marx said in the manifesto that education had to be taken away from the family and from the home, and it had to be taken over by the state. Lenin said the same. And you get through to the neo-Marxists, the cultural Marxists of the 1960s, like famously Herbert Marcuse, who grew up in Germany during the First World War, and then eventually ended up having escaped from Germany as a Jew to be on the west coast of America in university there. You get to his output in the 1960s, and Marcuse is openly telling. He realizes by then the working class has been too benefited by capitalism, is actually prospering. The working class is never going to rise up because capitalism's done quite well. And all of Marx's predictions about the working class getting poorer and poorer and poorer and more exploited, well, in America, they're getting cars, they're getting fridges, they're able to take holidays, and actually capitalism is benefiting them. So he changes the direction of the trajectory to revolution. And he posits it in two groups of people, the middle-class young intellectuals and what he calls the black and brown members of the ghetto. He says to those students of his, and Marcuse is the nearest thing to a pop star philosopher you can get. You read his books, they're dense, they're difficult to work your way through, they're full of technical terms, but he'd go and lecture in Europe and hundreds or thousands would turn up. Remember, this is 68, the Paris barricades and whatever else, and the rise of student activism. He would say that he said to the middle-class kids, he said, do not take down the universities. Go into the universities. take over the universities from within. Now, within America, up until his time, university lecturers were predominantly conservatives. And as we know from all the figures now, they are a tiny minority.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've seen is we've actually seen the ideas that Marcuse was putting forward and others, and we're now seeing them manifested. Because if you want to change society, where do you go? The schools, the universities.
Mm-hmm.
The early Soviet communists recognized that you could not get children unless you could take them away from their family. The wife of Grigory Zinoviev, Zina Levina, said, children are malleable like wax. We must nationalize children. Terrifying. That is what they specifically did. Another intellectual of the time said it is absolutely incompatible that a socialized child could grow up in a family. And it's why Lenin, amongst others, wanted to see communal living. Communal flats were not just a consequence of Soviet impoverishment. They were also a deliberate social policy to break up the family.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you come back now to the 1960s, and you are getting the first generation of students saying, okay, I will go into academia. Now, Marcuse's most famous postgraduate student, Angela Davis, the doyen communist inspiration for Black Power, visit Moscow, member of the Communist Party, I think maybe even stood as a communist in the presidential election. I can't remember. But you've got from her, you've got the whole of the BLM movement. Why do the leaders of BLM say we are trained Marxists? Why do they say we want to take the family down? Because they know the family is the institution which will keep children safe by the perpetuation of small c conservative values. So the university and the schools are where Marxists, socialists, whichever way you call them, can capture the next generation. They are not going to be able to capture the grown adults.
Mm-hmm.
They have the long game, the long march through the institutions. So they take this forward. And when you get to the professional educators, Paulo Freire, whose book Pedagogy, depending whether you're doing the American or British pronunciation, has had 750,000 volumes, basically the theory of teaching. So every teacher training college will use his work. He was a Brazilian Marxist. Now he and his associates said their target was to get 100 of their students into tenured positions in American universities. Each one would have hundreds or thousands of students running through their classrooms in the course of a lifetime. Take over the teacher training educational movements. And it's no coincidence that you'll see the major teacher training unions in Britain and in America are all so predominantly left-wing, so radically far left. That's no coincidence at all. And then you see why today we have teachers happily decolonizing curriculum, going on about transgender activism, supporting BLM and whatever else. And, they are within public schools, some of these people, and they are actually co-opting children towards socialism. Now, how much do each of you, I think, Lenin talked about the useful idiots. At what point, and it's on a spectrum, at what point do you go from the doctrinaire socialist who knows exactly how they are taking down capitalism, exactly how they are trying to propagandize children, through to someone who's no idea what they're doing.
But like, as you said earlier, thinks it's a good thing and wants sharing and the positive.
I came across an example. It was in the press the other day of a children's nursery, 3 to 4 year olds, who had in their equality, diversity or statement or whatever else, said they intended to provide a safe space for children to be able to talk about their gender identity and to provide a place where transgender, bisexual or whatever else, or gender questioning children would feel safe. 3 to 4 year olds. Now, I don't think that the people who drew that up, box ticking, had any idea what they were actually the hands, the fingers of as the wider movement and the history that there was behind it. But they are surely that, because the whole of queer theory and transgender ideology is designed to take down the heteronormative family, heteronormativity. Why do you end up with an organization like Educate and Celebrate, which is now mysteriously just simply gone out of business, leading teachers in training days in chants of smash heteronormativity? For goodness sake.
Wow.
Do they know what they're doing? Well, if you go back to the theorists, Judith Butler, Gail Rubin and others, if you go back to the theorists who have set the tone for what they're teaching, yeah.
A quick interruption to your show. If you would like exclusive content, exclusive interviews, and exclusive videos, come over to the Winston Marshall Substack. It's at winstonmarshall.co.uk, and there you can interact with me directly. It's winstonmarshall.co.uk, and you'll find links in the comments below. But back to the interview. Earlier, you described Marcuse's appeal was that, or rather, at that time, the free market enterprise, and I don't accept capitalism as the opposite of socialism. I accept free market enterprises.
There are lots of nuances.
Right. It wasn't actually, it was lifting up the working classes. Today, can you really say the same thing? Actually, society, economically, it's much harder young people are not getting onto the housing market. It's much harder to start family. It's way more expensive. So might part of the appeal of socialism be that free market enterprise in Britain today isn't actually working very well?
I think that's valid. I think you identify the issues which would lead good ordinary people to say there must be something else. Now, if the only offering is socialism, whatever that means, if the only offering is state intervention to enable them to get on the housing ladder or whatever, then no wonder. Of course it's attractive. But they may not. Why should they know what it is that actually lies behind the thing that they think is going to give them what they want? Now, you can have social democrats in power as a Labour government, and they will never go any further than maybe a very interventionist social democracy. Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, and Andrew Murray would have pushed for a very, very different outcome.
Now, someone listening might say, well, those people are behind Labour have turned a new leaf, although I remind them not only that Jeremy Corbyn is still in the Houses of Parliament, but also that he is unbelievably popular. He's been part of these anti-Israel, pro-Palestine marches, and he has a huge reach and appeal to British people. So these might be individuals you call out, but actually the ideas that they hold are extremely popular amongst the British electorate. Can I go back also one more step to, if I may, because there's so many interesting things here, but you say that socialism is a surrogate religion, a secular religion.
Yeah.
Yet there are Christian socialists, and there's a tradition of Christian socialism. Is Christianity and socialism, are they compatible?
No, I don't think they're compatible. They're Christian social democrats. If you would say to them, your Christian socialism, if it is to be truly socialist, must embrace violence as the mechanism by which societal transformation takes place. They would say, absolutely not. No. And I would say, well, in that case, you are not a true socialist. Because the dynamic of revolution is inseparable from violence. Marx said it, Lenin said it, Trotsky said it, Engels said it, right over the whole history of the period. So you may then say, well, socialism isn't that, but fine. You can call it socialism, but it isn't socialism. It's not the socialism of John McDonnell. And I'm not so sure about Jeremy Corbyn. I don't know that he actually knew quite so much about it, was quite so sure in his theory. McDonnell certainly was, and certainly is. But that's what I would say to them. I think the two are completely incompatible because socialism does not allow freedom of choice. It does not allow property ownership. It doesn't allow you to take control of your own life. Socialism has to use you as a person, as one of hundreds of thousands of millions who are at the disposal of the great project of building the communist utopia. Why do you see so often the history of Soviet repression just discarding all these lives? Why was it that Stalin didn't think twice about issuing instructions for hundreds of thousands of people to be shot within the 18 months of the Great Terror? Because they were all disposable in the project of the greater good. And this is the bizarre contradiction, devastating, evil contradiction of communism, the only route to the happiness of the whole of humanity is this new thing which will come about once we've slaughtered millions. And nobody stops to say, well, people do, but not enough people to stop to say, that's crazy. Absolutely barking mad.
I'd flip that question a little bit around. The historian, not the actor, Tom Holland, argued in his book Dominion that wokeism, and if my memory is correct, socialism, are the progeny of Christianity. Yeah. Do you think that that's true? Do you think that socialism and Christianity might not be compatible, but actually socialism is a philosophical descendant of Christianity?
Well, I think Christianity is a very broad term because you will find offshoots of Christianity which have as part of their belief system nothing that can be found in the Bible at all. So I'd question, are they actually Christianity or are they simply labeled Christianity? And you get some weird cults also which say that they are Christian and, they're waiting for the end of the world to come on the 31st of February, 19 whenever. So no, I think that they're ideas that have taken some of the selling points of Christianity, if you like, and have then incorporated them as part of their own faith systems. I think Tom Holland has a very, very important point in his books where he's basically, saying, look at the whole foundation of the history of Western society and see how deeply rooted it is in Christianity and how Christianity now moving forward to our present day has set so much of what we as a society take for granted. The terrifying thing is that we have now wholesalely, is that a word? Abandoned that. What comes in its place? Nature abhors a vacuum. The human spirit abhors a belief system vacuum. So it means that anything can come in its place. And the anything that comes in its place can be what some people, and I think Kengel might have said, is a demonic counterfeit. And, you do have this. I mean, if you're going to start talking about the demonic counterfeits, Marx went to university in Berlin in 1936.
1836.
1836, apologies. 1836. 12 years before the publication of the Communist Manifesto. He had grown up as a moderately devout Christian. I've read some of his school output, and doctrinally, it's emphatically Christian. Now, his father was a Jew who converted to Protestantism because the repression of the time was such that he couldn't practice as a lawyer unless he did so. So you could say he was a nominal Christian. But Marx was brought up in a school, and his teenage essays reflected the faith that he'd been brought up in. Went to university, and in university he had a crisis. The crisis was the equivalent of it was a breakdown. He had a complete breakdown. And in that breakdown, he not only lost his faith, but he actually started writing satanic poetry, which is fascinating if you read into it, because there is all sorts of stuff within there which is distinctly and deliberately satanic. He was flirting with other things. And out of that came not a militant atheism, but something that one writer has called misotheism, an absolute hatred of God.
Mm.
And Marx believed in taking down the conventionally Christian nation before he ever embraced communism.
Mm.
Communism, meeting communists, came after he had started this road of hatred towards Christianity, which you see reflected right through the history of the Soviet Union. Believers just en masse shot, taken off to the Gulag or whatever. And I think that's a really important component in that. He talked later on about religion being the opium of the masses. Actually, no, early on he talked about it being the opium of the masses and whatever else. But he was profoundly, he identified himself with Prometheus. And Prometheus was the character who took the fire from the gods and brought it down to earth, who took enlightenment away from heaven and brought it to mankind. And that's how he saw himself, taking away the place of enlightenment as being within religious belief and being in the knowledge of the heavenly, the knowledge of God, and taking it down to be the knowledge of mankind and of the mechanisms of history. But it's just never need to that part of his early life should not just be, he finally came round to communism because he had a little bit of an emotional crisis. No, he had a total breakdown, embraced Satanism for a while, but never lost the absolute hatred of Christianity.
Is there evidence he embraced Satanism?
In that you read his poetry. You read his poetry.
It's Mephistophelian, you could say, but not Satanism. There's no outright worship of Satan. Is there?
Well, no, but the phraseology of whatever is he refers to, he does. It's complex and you need to understand it. But if you read it, you realize he is referring to the devil and the power of the devil and embracing the devil as his leader for a short period, right? He didn't carry on with that. This is playing around as a student. For goodness sake, students, we've all been there, and you play around with all sorts of different ideas, and doesn't mean that they are necessarily you 5-10 years later. But I just think it's important. This is one of the rabbit trails we've gone off on.
No, I think it's an important one. I mentioned it at the beginning. I think the story of Cain and Abel is very important. How can you hate something that you don't think exists? If you hate it, you must actually believe in it. And so if you're not worshipping it, there's an anger there. And that's why I think that resentment is the energy that animates a lot of communism and socialism.
When you talk about the anger, you're absolutely right. Yeah. It was there from the beginning.
We must come to your book.
Okay.
So people approaching communism, they'll perhaps start with the the death count, maybe. And you've mentioned Solzhenitsyn. He says in the Soviet Union there are 60 million dead, but everyone agrees that there are at least 20 million dead. Robert Conquest, I said earlier, said Lenin himself oversaw 12 million dead. This book is a really phenomenal introduction to the very daunting topic of the gulags, which is astonishing to think, just because of how evil it was, and you go into some of the figures, that this isn't even the primary evil of the Soviet Union. Maybe you can, to listeners, give an introduction to the book. How did this book come about? Maybe it would be even helpful to tell me about your journey from your last book about labour in the Gulag, the British left relationship with the Soviet Union, to writing this book, which is, I would say, an introduction to the Gulag.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my own work on the Gulag stretches back a good 20 years, I think. And the book that is always in filing cabinets waiting to be written is actually the history of one particular group of camps which have somehow or other gripped me right up in the high Russian Arctic, in a place called Norilsk, which sits on 1/3 of the world's reserves of nickel, with also vast reserves of copper. It's now owned by an oligarch. And Norilsk comes into there. There are photographs of one small labor camp in Norilsk. But I found out about this place. It is extraordinary. 6 weeks of darkness in the winter, 300 miles above the Arctic Circle, 800 miles away from the nearest road system. Impossible to mine this wealth for the building of the glory of socialism until they had a supply of disposable labor, Gulag prisoners. And they would go up there. Temperature goes down to -50 in the winter, completely isolated. The only way in would have been by boat. And I've managed to get in there 2 or 3 times. It was a closed city. It opened up briefly. I now have a record with the local FSB, KGB, because I had to get a permit through someone locally. I was invited in actually by a local Christian Pentecostal who also happened to be a business leader, and he had enough clout with the authorities to be able to get me in. But I mean, I landed. This is a little byproduct. I landed in the airplane, and everyone else got off, and I was told, "No, you stay there." I didn't speak Russian. You stay there. And then a military jeep turned up to escort me off the airplane, and I was taken to the airport police station lockup and held there until these people came with the right papers to claim me.
When was this?
This would be 2004, probably 2005.
Okay.
And I went back there a couple of times. And
why were they so strict even then? I mean, this is
Russia. This is Russia.
But I've been to Russia a few times, even under Putin, and Putin was president at that time.
Yeah.
Why was it still?
Well, for a start, it was a state asset. Secondly, it had always been a secret city, with the influx of foreigners totally banned.
Mm-hmm.
The metal quantity, whatever you call the word, I've lost it for the moment, was a state secret. And this place was still strictly controlled, and the paranoia continued. I did a bit of talking in the churches because I've got a church connection, and my interpreter and I used to have this joke. Okay, spot the KGB man. Do you think it was the guy on the third row?
Yeah.
The one that asked the most stupid questions to try and seem as if he was really part of the crowd. And at another point, I was going round the monuments which the deported peoples from the Baltic states and Poland were able to get back after the fall of communism and build there on the old graveyard. I mean, permafrost there is it's only about 18 inches below the surface. So if you want to dig graves, you've got to get a pneumatic drill out to dig through the ice. But these bodies are underneath there. I don't know how many thousands and thousands died. 300,000 prisoners went through it over the course of its life. But I'm there looking around, and suddenly this person turns up speaking perfect English with one of those portable tape recorders underneath my mouth, and says, "We'd love you to tell us what you think of our city." Now, my friends in Moscow call it Mordor, right? Because the pollution is so bad, there is nothing alive for miles around. Every tree is dead. When the Swedes complained about the pollution coming off the Arctic, they just chopped off a bit of the chimneys. You come out in the morning from the flat these people provided for me, and they feel on their tongue, is the wind coming from the west or the east? Because that's the nickel factory and that's the copper factory. And we can tell which way the wind's coming by what we can taste, right? So she wanted me to say, this is a hellhole. Actually, the people I met there are just fantastic. And my interpreter comes up and says to me, I do not think you should be answering this.
Yeah.
And then the guy who'd been inviting me in said, golly, get lost. And she scarpered off. What they were trying to do is they were trying to set me up to expel me. And, even amongst the ordinary people, I went to have tea with one lovely old lady, and she started berating me about the fact that Churchill hadn't started the Second Front earlier in the Second World War. And anyway, but we digress slightly. It's through that, and it's through walking round the remains of camps and reading memoirs, that you really start to engage with the suffering of individuals. You can talk about hundreds of thousands or millions dead, but when you get the individual stories, that's when the power of what they've suffered comes across. And oh goodness, there's not a question. Excuse me, I'm cracking. See, there's not a moment when you read that and you realize what each of these individuals. Sorry about that. That was unexpected. Yeah. What each of these individuals have gone through. That's what's driven me. That story should be known. That these people who died in places hundreds or thousands of miles away from their home would have some kind of testimony. That their stories would not go untold. That's what drove Solzhenitsyn. That's why he produced 3 magisterial books. But no one's going to start on no one's going to start on the 3 volumes. And Anne Applebaum's Gulag, superb book. But again, it's thick, it's dense. The purpose of that is to be able to enable people to come in for the first time, understand something of it. I've got photographs there of some of the cells in the remaining punishment block up in Norilsk. The worst of the worst. This is where people were sent to be punished. It's if the ordinary camps, because it's a whole group of camps, weren't bad enough. This is where they went. The cell that's completely open so that people are exposed to Arctic flies which bite like crazy, or the cold in the winter, where the door is studded like a cheese grater, so you can't bang on it to be let out without your hands breaking. Where further along there's a corridor where there is a complete dark cell, where these people were kept all day long behind 2 doors with one plank that folds up on the side, and you're not allowed to put it down again or lie down except when you're allowed to in certain hours from 11 to 5, where your clothes are taken and you're left in your underwear in complete dark. On punishment rations, normal rations are bad enough. It would take somebody already malnourished months to recover from that.
In freezing
These
cold.
are utterly ghastly. And what's even more ghastly about them is that people have had the evil ingenuity to work out these forms of punishment and torture. I can't get my head around that. So, I've got those stories. And then this dramatic photograph which we put in there of this of the Washington Monument. All of these flags which were put out all in rows in 2021 as the it's somewhere in there, somewhere towards the, probably where your finger is actually, because I think it's somewhere towards the back there. This extraordinary photograph of, see if you can find it there. It's there somewhere. There we are. That's it. This extraordinary photograph of the Washington Monument to those who died in COVID. Each one a little flag. Now you look at that. Stalin ordered 10,000 more than you can see flags in that photograph to be shot in just 18 months. Now that really brings it home.
Wow. Yeah.
Then you start to see what the mounds of bodies really mean. because the figures otherwise are so unquantifiable.
Yeah, you go into some of the figures here. Starting from 1918, 18 million people were sent to the Gulag, 6 million people were deported, usually to these remote, inhospitable places, and 2.75 million of those deported in the Gulag died of cold. One particular fact stood out reading was what happened in 1937 and 1938 alone in Stalin's Great Terror, which, I'll find the figures, that 681,692 executions, according to the NKVD themselves. So this scale of what's going on, and you've honed into it. When you look at these figures, they're absolutely unfathomable. So it's how to even access and understand that. And unlike the Holocaust, where we have a lot of literature and also personal accounts, because we know people who survived, or I certainly do, and have been grown up with that, had that story. With the Gulag, we in the West don't. And I wonder if that's maybe part of an earlier answer to an earlier question about why socialism, communism.
I think that's true. You see, there were no photographers as there were going into Belsen and Auschwitz. There was no Western publicity. Nothing appeared. Nothing appeared in the press. There's a photograph in there of one of the camps in Norilsk. Now, to have had that in your possession could have got you shot. We have the newsreels of the stacks of bodies in concentration camps found emaciated. We don't have those records. People who finally got out of the camps signed a declaration to say that they would never reveal the state secrets of their existence in the camps under threat of reincarceration. So today we have Holocaust survivors appearing on video and whatever else, or going around schools, and those that still survive still today telling their stories. That didn't happen.
Does it happen within Russia? How do the Russians deal with this history?
Today, today, statues of Stalin are being put back in place. They're being re-erected.
Lenin's remains in his mausoleum in Red Square.
Yeah, and statues of Lenin still are up everywhere. They're only knocked down in Ukraine. And Stalin is being rehabilitated because it serves Putin to have him completely reinterpreted as the great wartime leader, the leader of the Russian Soviet Empire. So Putin likes to model himself in the continuation of that. There's a sort of sleight of hand that the excesses are admitted but passed over in favor of his great wartime achievements, the reindustrialization of the Soviet Union, which was carried out predominantly by slave labor, all these millions of people who worked for absolutely nothing, mining, logging, building great big skyscrapers or whatever else. So the rehabilitation is going on. Now, you can go into, and I haven't been back to Russia for a long time now, and probably won't get back in my lifetime, it would seem. But you could go and sit down round a dining table the size of this table with maybe, say, 10 other people and ask them, did you have any relatives who were in the Gulag? Yep. My grandfather's brother, he died. Yeah, my mother's parents, they were both taken away. And, you imagine that happening around a dinner table in England with a whole group of friends all getting together after work. Those conversations are inconceivable.
Mm-hmm.
But they could well be the norm in Russia.
And despite that, Stalin remains a popular figure. It's not just that his statues are going up, but he's actually popular amongst the people.
Whoever owns the past owns the present. And the past is owned. School textbooks have been changed in Russia, so they gloss over this. Those who research Memorial, the great organization set up to commemorate those who who suffered in under repression, whether in the Gulag or elsewhere, has been shut down, and its records were initially seized, but they've managed to put them abroad, and it now only operates abroad. It's been declared to be an illegal organization. There's one amazing man, surname escapes me, Yuri someone, who has worked up in the Murmansk and region south, and the region south of the White Sea, which is, if you're thinking of Russia, right on the very west. He has uncovered some very significant mass graves where a lot of people from the Solovki Islands, which Stalin called the original cancerous tumor that metastasized all over Russia. It was the model for the Gulag, started in the 1930s. Plenty of people were brought from there and were shot at this mass grave. Well, now he's investigated these, he's discovered these, he's investigated them, he's worked as an archaeologist. Well, lo and behold, he gets arrested for child pornography, for having in possession photographs of his adopted daughter, which he'd taken to try and monitor the state of her health and malnutrition. There was a huge international outcry, and they eventually let him out after he'd been held inside for goodness knows how long, months or whatever else. So everyone thought, great, the West has managed to get this poor man free, because it's clearly trumped-up charge. Well, they just waited a year or two, got him again, locked him up. And now, of course, no one else would dare to do the same work exposing these atrocities. And then when bodies are discovered, as they were on one riverbank, I remember the story somewhere in Siberia, because the people who had been shot outside this town or village had been buried in the permafrost. The permafrost had actually preserved some of the bodies because they were essentially in deep freeze. And the erosion of the river had started to wash away the side, and as it had washed away the side, these bodies became apparent. Well, the villagers came out and they recognized people who'd disappeared.
Wow.
So the authorities shut the area down and said, no, these are prisoners of war who died in a camp. Everyone knows what they were. But who dares to say, when you now have a police state put back in place,
wow,
and you can be destroyed, if not actually physically, but your whole life can be destroyed in a moment with any trumped-up charge. You see, the one thing people never realized about the Soviet legal system, and again in its modern manifestation, the Russian legal system, is you'd get these British politicians who would defend the justice of Russian court sentences, and even who was it? It wasn't Hugh Dalton. I'll remember in a minute. Even the shadow attorney general in the 1930s, the Labour shadow attorney general, who defended the Russian Soviet death penalty as being just. If somebody was found guilty of that crime, then they were guilty of it, and they should suffer the consequences. These Western useful idiots never understood that once the revolution had come, the whole idea of a court system and justice, which, remember, Marx had said was previously constructed only to enable the bourgeois to hold on to their property and their power, now was simply used in that principle to enforce and promote the revolution. So decisions were no longer made on the basis of right or wrong. Decisions were made on the basis of revolutionary pragmatism. So an ordinary criminal who committed a crime would be interpreted as a victim of capitalist times, who was simply living in the legacy of it, poor man. He needed reformation. But you have somebody who came from the aristocratic class who had committed a similar crime. They would be going away, or they would be shot. that was the way in which the court system in Soviet Russia was completely corrupted to aid the revolution. So there was no, and how do you, as I put in my next book, how do you turn good people into killers? You reinterpret the definition of right and wrong. Judeo-Christianity says that it is wrong to murder. But you read what the Soviet communists wrote. If he is your class enemy, it is appropriate to kill him. Boom. The question always has been, for instance, with the cattle trains going off to the concentration camps during the war, or the cattle trains going off to the Gulag under Soviet communism, how could so many people be compliant to play a part in this system? And the answer, very simply, is that you rewire in their own brains their perception of good and evil. Because, of course, Marxism, socialism, has a different idea of what good and evil is. But when you see it in practice, then you realize that these millions, they are the consequences of this. I mean, if you're going to arrest 18 million people, you're going to abduct from their homes at no notice, simply because they are an ethnic group that you think might be a threat from the state and you want them out of that area, as happened with between 6 million and the figures are so huge we don't know, but probably about 6 million people who would be taken from their homes at a few hours' notice, loaded onto trains and dumped in the middle of Kazakhstan or somewhere like that. Of the 6 million, probably 1 million died. Men, women and children. Well, the men were mostly away during the war fighting, so they were away. So this is women and children. And I have a photograph of one of the mud huts in which some Poles who were taken from eastern Poland were put. How are you going to get all of these NKV, the secret police guards, to load these people, to turf them out of their houses, to see their distress, their utter terror at leaving a home from which they may never have moved more than 4 or 5 miles in the whole of their lives? How are you going to get these hundreds of thousands of people to be the servants of the state in the pursuit of mass deportation, of murder, with this moral conviction that they are in the right? This overriding thing which goes right through socialism. You see it in the people who claim to be socialists today. We are on the side of moral right. Everybody who does not agree with us is morally corrupt and despicable and whatever else. We are right, and because we are right, we can take any action we see fit because we are the moral pure ones. It's terribly, terribly dangerous.
Yeah, that also goes to explain how even the Nazis were able to perpetrate such evil. They thought, we have to look at the idea that they actually thought they were doing good. Now, with Stalin and Lenin, I want to pick apart these two characters because some people would say of Stalin, he was actually a psychopath and that he didn't think he was doing good. But so I'd be curious to think whether he thought he was doing good. But then I also want to look at Lenin, who, unlike Stalin, seems to get a free pass today. Stalin, even communists will distance themselves from Stalin. Yeah. Some, not all of them.
In favor of Trotsky, who was just...
In favor of Trotsky, right. But Lenin, he's almost still a hero. And I've had this experience. I bought a biography of Lenin at a New York bookshop once called McNally Jackson. And the shopping clerk said, "Oh, Lenin, I love Lenin." I mean, can you imagine if someone bought a biography of Hitler and said, "Oh, Hitler, I love," that's meant, I can't, it's unfathomable to think that. And yet today, Lenin, who killed so many people, who started, as you write, the gulags themselves, he does not have the rightful reputation that he really should have as having done great evil.
1906, 11 years before the revolution, he wrote, and this is as close a paraphrase as I can remember without the piece of paper being in front of me. We should not hide it from anyone that we will not achieve our aims without a bloody war of extermination. Those words, bloody war of extermination, are his, the precise preamble I'm paraphrasing. He knew from the beginning what was necessary to do. And it is absolutely right to say that Stalin simply built upon foundations that Lenin laid. It was Lenin that laid down the concentration camp system. It was Lenin that ordered that every town or city of a certain size should have a concentration camp.
Did he take the Tsarist system and continue it? Because there was that he set up a completely different system, because there was the Tsarist prison camp system.
There was indeed.
Not the same scale,
there
right?
was indeed. No, it was minor by comparison. I mean, you just got to look at the fact that Stalin and a number of other early Bolsheviks were arrested by the Okhrana, the Tsarist police. And they were simply sent off to Siberia to live in a village and carry on their normal life. And then eventually they got out, let out, or whatever else. That would not have happened after the revolution. It would have been in the Gulag or up against a wall. And that would have been it. And, there's 1926, I think it is, Holmagori, one of the camps right up on the western part of Russia, European Russia, right up in the north, a converted monastery was turned into a prison camp. But that became an extermination camp. 26,000 people were shot in that camp. That's not really a lovely, nice, kind-hearted regime. And you read what Lenin wrote, and you realize he was just as brutal. I mean, you talk about exploiting people's anger and resentment. Lenin's brother had been executed for an attempted assassination attempt on the Tsar. What drove him was anger and hatred. It was not, let's all be nice and kind to the people and give them some freedom and raise the standard of living. He then incorporated a philosophy in which murder and violence was an integral part. It was the only way through. Violence, in Marx's words, quoted by Engels, is the midwife of history. And then when you go through to Stalin too, you see that Stalin was actually a real... I mean, Lenin's wife wrote of Lenin that his knowledge of Marx was encyclopedic and almost unparalleled. Again, I paraphrase her. Go forward to Stalin, and you find people have looked at his books, and his copies of Marx and Lenin are full of annotations and margin notes.
Well, Stalin wrote a big critique of Leninism.
Yeah.
It's said of Lenin that Lenin put into practice what Marx wrote. And maybe that's why Marx has got a bit of does not have
yes.
because he wrote the thesis, but he didn't actually carry out the horror of it all.
Marx's reputation is dependent entirely upon who is telling it, because nobody's going to read through Das Kapital. Really, seriously. Hal Wilson gave up on the first page. He said, as soon as he saw the first page had a footnote which was longer than the page, that was enough for him. There was one one famous economist of the time who said, I really cannot understand why people look at this. And he was, I think he was a socialist, a democratic, whatever. He was on the left. He said, I can't understand how anyone can conceive that this has been a great Bible. But you just try reading the manifesto. And honestly, the manifesto is pretty turgid, hard stuff to get through.
No, I'd say the manifesto is very accessible, and everyone should read it to see what it's, because it's kind of everything's in there.
Okay.
It's completely incoherent, and
that's what I mean. I think that's what I'm saying.
It's got horrible things, as you've said a few times. Yeah. The violence is the midwife of history. Yeah. It's explicitly bloody and violent. Yeah. So it's a horrible book, but everyone should read it.
I think everyone should read it. I think what I'm trying to say is that it's not terribly accessible, right? So, I got my copy of the Communist Manifesto when I was a teenager at school, and I was very proud to have it and called myself a communist. I never read the thing.
You called yourself a communist, Charles? Wow, this is a bombshell. I didn't know what communist was, but I didn't know what communist was age 17. It was just the cool way of rebelling way, way back when I was at school. So when did you no longer identify as a communist?
I should think within a year or two.
Right, okay. As soon as you opened the book and started reading.
No, just because that was the hip, cool thing to be. Then I got into surrealist art, and I became a surrealist. Didn't understand what surrealism was either. I thought that sounded even more cool.
Back to Lenin and Stalin. What do you think in all the literature of these people is missed by other historians? What did you discover in your research here that you don't think is given the spotlight or hasn't been focused on like it ought to have already?
That's an interesting question. Everyone talks about standing on the shoulders of giants or whatever. I don't think there's anything I particularly brought in. I mean, my work on Norilsk, nobody else has done, and there are stories in there which no one else has taken up. I think what I've done is more of a distillation and choosing which bits of a vast oeuvre of history, because Solzhenitsyn and Anna Applebaum are by no means the other one. There's some very, very eminent historians who've written on the subject, and voluminous memoirs, not just of those who lived within Soviet Russia, but those who were deported from the Baltic states, from Poland and whatever else, who keep the story alive. What I think the book has done, and looking at it again, I think it's managed to achieve it, is to distill this massive information into a few really startling vignettes which represent the whole story. There's a photograph in there of a little kid, Misha Shamonin. Misha was a Moscow street kid. He was, I think, 12, it was either 12 or 13, when he was arrested for stealing 2 loaves of bread. He was 13. He was arrested for stealing 2 loaves of bread. Just earlier, the Soviet Penal Code had been changed to say that everybody down to the age of 12 was liable to be treated as an adult in a Soviet court. Realizing how despicable it would be to sentence a 13-year-old, his interrogator wrote down the records of him being 16, and he was shot. A Moscow street kid for stealing 2 loaves of bread. And you look at the photograph, and it's the photograph. You think, he's a kid. He's just a child. Elena Amberg on the front cover, who the publishers have been very clever when they've got those cutouts of jail bars. Elena Amberg, a very ordinary girl. I mean, there are lots of these. These are the prison mugshots, right? These are the prison mugshots. And you look at these people and you know the majority of them were shot. You look at that photograph, she's an ordinary woman, in her 30s. She was a clerk in a ball bearing factory when she was arrested. Just a single woman, a clerk, and someone's pointed out to me, which I'd seen the blemish under her eye. Someone pointed out to me, she's got a black eye. That's from her interrogation. So she was arrested, accused, because Amberg is a German name, accused of espionage. A clerk in a ball-bearing factory. And they shot her. And her body lies with thousands of others in a mass grave outside Moscow. And you look at that, and you look at those eyes, and you think, what do you just think? This is individuals. All those flags, each one was an individual, with a mother and a father and siblings and friends. And imagine the terror in her factory when one day she disappeared. Everyone by then would have known what had happened. She'd been arrested. You don't talk about it. It just as if it didn't happen. Another of the photographs is of Sakharov's wife, who as a young woman lived in this extraordinary hotel in the middle of Moscow. I've been there. It's now been taken over and rebuilt as luxury flats, but I was privileged, if that's the word, to be taken round by a friend in Moscow up to the first floor. It was already halfway beyond the fall of communism. It was a chic coffee shop underneath. But it had originally been a hotel, and that it had been taken over by the Bolsheviks, the early communists, and it had been used to house all their leading foreign communist dignitaries, those who were assigned to work in Moscow for the Communist Party of Bulgaria or whatever, or whatever. And she lived there. She lived there with her mother and her father, stepfather. And she tells how in the night time they would hear the footsteps coming down the corridors. And they'd wake up in the morning and another pair of doors or single door in this hotel would have tape over it. And they'd know somebody else had been taken away. And then they took her stepfather away. And she and her mother were moved to an annex outside in the courtyard of the hotel, because the hotel didn't want anything to do with them. And all of the people they knew completely cut them dead, because they didn't dare be associated with them. And then she managed to get out to stay with a grandmother in Leningrad, and her mother was arrested and sent off to a camp for the wives of dignitaries, because they passed a new law to say that if you were the wife or a child of somebody who had been arrested on a serious charge, and it wasn't very difficult to get arrested on a serious charge, as a political prisoner, as an enemy of the state, you were contaminated by your association with them. Against this system, there is no redemption. There is no way of getting out of your contamination by your birth. Why today do the children who are innocently sent away to public schools, who are nothing to do with their parents' decision, why do they become contaminated by the left? They become contaminated because of the class that they are. Anyway, so her mother was taken off. Her uncle disappeared. The family were told that he'd been sentenced to 10 years without the right of correspondence. People then realized after the event that without the right of correspondence meant that they were actually shot. And he was shot about 2 months after his arrest. So the mother was taken off to this camp and joined thousands of other wives/widows and children of people who who'd been arrested, who they were married to. In that camp, which was down on the southern part of Russia, there were over 1,500 recorded births as a result of rape by the guards.
Wow.
If you did not have any living relatives who could take you, and sometimes you'd find the grandparents would refuse to because they become contaminated by taking their grandchild. If both your parents had been arrested, you were sent off to an orphanage. You were sent off to a state orphanage, where sometimes you were given a new name, a new identity. Or if you kept your old identity, you were berated constantly for being the child of an enemy of the state, as happened with the Finnish family that I mentioned in there, where both their parents, seduced by the idea of coming to Russia, thought, we will leave Finland, we will make our way to the Workers' Republic because we'll find work there, because it's the Depression, we can't find work at home. They fled across the border. They were immediately arrested as spies. They spent 3 months in incarceration, and then they were finally sent to a series of factories, eventually ending up 1,500 miles east. The wife never wanted to leave Finland, but the husband forced them to go with their 2 little girls. Disillusionment set in pretty quickly, so they applied to the Finnish embassy to get their Finnish passports back, which they'd given up when they crossed the border. They got them, I think it was in November, but it was too late because the order had already gone out for foreign Finnish spies to be eliminated. 1 month later, the men were all told they were going to be taken off to a new worksite because they lived in a camp with these Finns outside this aluminium factory that they were working in. So one morning, the men were all told that they were going to be going off to a new factory. So they were taken off, leaving the wives and children behind. The men were put on one train. And then a few hours later, the women and children were put on another train. And shortly after that, the children were extracted from the women. Those 2 little girls never saw their parents again. They went off to one of these orphanages where they were abused constantly for being enemies of the state. They eventually, after the fall of Stalin, they eventually managed to apply in the 1950s for information about what had happened to their parents and receive rehabilitation certificates for their parents to show that their parents hadn't actually committed any crime. They were told that the father had died of a heart attack and the mother had died of food poisoning or something like that. It wasn't until the fall of communism that they managed to actually get hold of the records, which proved that both their parents had been shot. And finally, 60 years later or whatever it was, the 2 girls were able to make their way back to Finland, where their father had, foolishly wanting a better life, made the decision which had blighted them for life and caused the death of 2 parents. Back in England, George Bernard Shaw was encouraging other British workers to do exactly the same. And some of those didn't return either. Some of those perished in the purges.
Do we have a sense of how many people moved to Russia for this?
No, but I would say it's probably in the hundreds.
In the hundreds?
In the hundreds.
So there even some British people did that. I remember there's a scene in Malcolm Muggeridge's book about Moscow. It's called, he wrote a fiction. He says it's not really a fiction.
You've seen a copy of that?
Yes.
Oh, I'd like to see that. I've been trying to find one.
Oh, really? Oh, you can find them on eBay. But he describes an Englishman, I think, from Bow, being in, and maybe he'd come across as a journalist, but wanting to move and be part of the revolution. So there was a sense of, and you document that in your first book.
There's a very good documentary which came out. I don't think they put it out on TV now because I think it was about 3 hours long. On the Gulag, which came out way back around 2000, I think. Angus McQueen produced it. And he went round interviewing people in those days because they were still alive. They aren't now. And actually, one of the people he interviewed was the British descendant of some people who'd come over to sign up to build the great Workers' Republic, the great experiment that was going to change the whole world.
Can you imagine?
And didn't.
Wow.
But there we are. So yes. You ended up with me telling you stories of some of these people, but that's what's in the book. And it's these things which really bring home a mass story and provide the way in, I think, for people to be able to to, did it kill 100 million? The figure's irrelevant in a way. What you need to see is how it came about, what the history of it was, what the cost was, and it was all for no point at all. It was all an utter waste. And they tried and tried to maintain the fiction that the utopia was coming, but in the end it just completely ran out of steam. And few people really believed that that was ever going to happen. It was a sham that was kept up. There was nothing else to do. The queues for food set by state quotas still arrived. At least they weren't killing people by state quota, which is what they've been doing in the 1930s. Instructions going out to each, as again is in there, going out to each region. You are to arrest X thousand of these people, of whom X thousand must be shot. They did it so diligently in one region at least. They actually cabled back to Moscow and said, well, we've done all that. We've shot all those people. Can we arrest some more? We'd like to do another couple of thousand or whatever. And the permission came back from Moscow. Yes, by all means. It's inconceivable. It's this totally inconceivable. But I think what these things teach us is that the inconceivable is not impossible. We always wonder, how could it be that the whole of the German nation could become co-opted to the goals of Nazism? Because war couldn't be declared unless they had been. Hitler couldn't have done it on his own. And then you see the build-up that's taken place in Russia today, and you see the same process is taking place all over again. When I look at what's happened with that, and I blamed a lot, I have blamed and continue to blame a lot of what happened under communism on Marx. But then you got this thing that Marxism is over in Russia. But in plenty of ways, they're still behaving the same. How's that come about? I'm still trying to get my head around that.
Do you mean the totalitarian mindset or the tendency?
How is it that they are assassinating dissident journalists? How is it that they are controlling the media with a completely false narrative? How is it that so many of the population, apparently now in some areas it's only 50-50, are totally behind the decimation of Ukrainian neo-Nazis? How do these things, how have they happened? But then you realize you have...
How they're totally behind the decimation of Ukrainian neo-Nazis?
Or
you mean Ukrainians?
No, people, they call them Nazis, sorry.
Right, okay. Nazis. Yeah, right.
Ukrainians.
Some of them are.
Yeah, but a very small number. And probably as big a percentage actually in Russia still, where Nazism is very popular amongst a certain younger age group. Where was I?
Well, so I don't know the answer to that question because I don't know Russia well enough. But I wanted to bring this back to Britain.
Yeah.
Again, right at the beginning of this conversation, how socialism, communism is not socially unacceptable. But our country famously is a moderate one. We had a revolution, but it was not a bloody one. We had a civil war, but then we reinstated our king.
Yeah.
We have a constitution that's somewhat flexible and seems to have unlike our European neighbours in Russia, has accommodated and meant that we've had this sort of moderate history. And I wondered whether you felt that Britain was safe from this totalitarian regime that you described in this conversation in both your books. What are the lessons for Britain specifically in all of this?
The lesson, which I think is what I've just referred to, is that no matter how inconceivable it is, and it is inconceivable in this country, right? It is inconceivable. We accept that.
Yeah.
There is no point at which the inconceivable cannot happen within a generation or two. if the setup, build up to it, takes a certain pattern. And I think that's why we still need to be on our guard. Proper democracy, not people's democracy, which actually means things are run by small committees of the state. Proper democracy needs to be protected. People should not be complacent. Well, we will always morph to it. No. The history of societies in the 20th century shows that they will not automatically morph towards good unless the good, and I believe that Western liberalism, or whatever it is, however you describe it, and the words used differently on other side, I believe that it is a fundamentally good institution, system, whatever else. It has to be protected. People have to realize, first of all, what it is that they are protecting, and then they have to be on their guard against the subtle erosion of it. And that's what's happened in these places, the subtle erosion that's taken place. Germany in the 1930s. Was it inconceivable in 1928 where they would end up in 1938, marching into Austria?
But Russia, it's not so subtle necessarily. It sort of happened. The Bolsheviks is a very small group of people who took advantage. So it's not even necessarily that it's a subtle gradual thing. It can happen overnight, or in that case, it happened over 6 months, I guess. That a country can be turned around.
What's happening in this country at the moment? A tiny group of activists are taking over the narrative. Now, it's now being resisted, but if we just like to go, say, for instance, into transgenderism, how can you now have Miss Netherlands being a woman or a man, whichever way you like to call them, with a penis? Something's happened. How have we got from one state of Europe to that in that period? You go back there, people say, totally impossible, come on. And you can see so many other different variations of it. If Corbyn had won, through being able to dupe vast numbers of people that he and his associates were a kindly group of grandpas and whatever else, if he'd got in, we would be seeing more radical change. But my goodness, we're seeing plenty of radical change at the moment. I mean, what's been happening in the last 100 days has been extraordinary, not entirely unpredicted. So, but, this is what we've got to keep an eye on. We need to consciously know what it is we're protecting and never take anything for granted. I can't remember which historian it is that has said that we have made a mistake to look at history as being a whole pattern of peace interrupted by war. We should instead look at world history as a whole pattern of war interrupted by peace. Now, if it's interrupted by peace and you look at it in that way, people recognize there is something to be protected and something to be maintained over the long term. And that if they don't maintain it over the long term, the driving pattern will reassert itself. People think, going by the first thing, that the driving pattern is peace and that will reassert itself. That's how we were brought up. That's how I was brought up to believe things. But I don't think that's the case.
On that note, Giles Udy, phenomenal, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know listeners will have been as enthralled as I am. Where can they find
Amazon Now, at last?
Amazon Now, at dawn,
last.
They came, Soviet Terror and Repression from 1917 to 1953. And I must also recommend, as I have done already a couple of times, your last book, Labour and the Gulag, although that's harder to find these days because it's sold out very quickly.
Publishers gave it back to me, and I have a second edition with a few little corrections, which basically you have to get from my website. But I'm on Twitter, gilesudy.com and everything else, so I can easily be tracked down. And those copies I'm still selling to people.
I'm very excited also for your next book.
Yeah.
When you're ready, when it's done and published, please come back on the show.
The conversation.
We're digging into that. It doesn't seem like socialism is going anywhere soon. Giles Udy, a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show with Giles Udy. If you want to support the show, all you have to do is press the subscribe button. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Giles Udy exploring the topics that you at home want to hear about. But for now, be well.